Janaga was found dead in her apartment in Redmond, outside of Seattle.
He said, "I'm sorry to tell, man, she's no more." And I was like, "No, are you sure about that? That cannot be."
Arpana had been killed in the wake of a Halloween party at her complex. As investigators began to look into the murder, they used a shorthand to describe witnesses and potential people of interest. The construction worker, the bank robber, Jesus' secretary. But eventually they trained their focus on one man, Emanuel Fair.
And he's like, "I'm at Washington State Penitentiary." He's like, "I don't know why I'm here. They just brought me here." And I was like, "What do you mean?" I was like, "How do you not know this stuff?"
A major part of the case against Emanuel Fair involved DNA. And some of his DNA did appear on the victim's body and clothing. But other suspects had left their DNA on the scene too. And when it came time for Emanuel to stand trial, almost a decade after Arpana's death, his lawyer, Ben Goldsmith, questioned the state's interpretation of the DNA.
There are all these things that were aligning against Emanuel, which made it all that much more important to be the person who would try to help.
Did it really show that Emanuel was the killer? Or had prosecutors made up their mind, then used DNA to fit their theory of the case? Emanuel Fair is now a free man, has been for a couple of years. He's in the process of putting his life back together. Together with a civil lawyer, he's preparing a lawsuit against King County. Still, justice feels a long way off. No one else has been arrested for the murder of Arpana, and the case remains, for all intents and purposes, completely cold. In this episode, I'm talking with Matt Baglio, reporter and host of the third season of Over My Dead Body. Matt Baglio and I will talk about getting out and reporting, what the case at the Center of Suspects says about the American criminal justice system, and what's next for Emanuel Fair. From Campside Media and Wondery, I'm Matthew Scher, and this is a special episode of Suspect. In Suspect, we chronicle some of the challenges that arise in the course of a complex murder investigation. How do you get answers when only two people have them, and one of them is dead? In Over My Dead Body, Fox Lake, the team is also seeking answers about a murder investigation. I actually reported and hosted season 1 of Over My Dead Body, which was called Tally. It told the story of the murder of a renowned law professor in Tallahassee, Florida. Season 2 was the story of the feud between Joe Exotic and Carol Baskin. This season is about another conflict pushed to the limit, and the mysterious death of a police officer in a town called Fox Lake. Today, I'm going to hand the interviewing duties off to Matt Baglio, the reporter and host of Fox Lake. Without further ado, Matt, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Matt, for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Listen to Suspect, and I have to say I was really, really impressed with the amount of time and effort that you and your team put into reporting this story. So, Matt, this podcast was quite an undertaking, and I'm curious to know how it got started. In the podcast, you mentioned that you got an email out of the blue informing you about Arpana's murder and the main suspect, Emanuel. Why did you respond to that email?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because this is a podcast that was directly inspired by one email that in another circumstance I might have overlooked. I think if you report on the criminal justice system enough, you're used to these emails or letters, and sometimes they come from people who are incarcerated, sometimes they come from families of people who are incarcerated, sometimes they come from lawyers, and the honest truth is that a lot of the time you really want to respond, but you also don't know what you're able and what you can do for this person, right? I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a police officer. I'm not a private investigator. I'm a journalist. So I always try to respond, but I also always try to be honest about what I might be capable of doing for somebody. But this email was different because it was an email that I felt like I actually did have an answer to, because the email involved DNA science, forensic DNA. And I just finished this long investigation for the Atlantic magazine about DNA science, about how it can be misinterpreted by people and how technology is getting so good that it's almost too sensitive in some cases. Anyway, all to say that I was basically primed to receive this kind of email. And when I got it, the email said, there's this case, it involves DNA, it's a murder investigation, it's ongoing. I did reply and I did say, I'm just coming off this article. This is something that I may be able to help with because not only do I know the subject matter relatively well, but I had just finished interviewing a bunch of folks in the field, lawyers and forensic analysts who were really involved with thinking through what the repercussions of this advanced technology could be on the criminal justice system and who it was being used for and who it was being used against. So I wrote back right away, and it was a matter of days before I was in touch with Emmanuel's attorneys.
You mentioned that you get a lot of emails. I know you're an investigative journalist. You're looking at stories. So had you heard about this story in any way? Had you read the news articles or anything before this email had got to you?
No, I mean, and this is probably a point worth making, that this is a story that, and I still don't know why this is the case, what the answer to this is, or the explanation, but this is a story that had really not resonated outside the Pacific Northwest. And in fact, even if you lived in Seattle or in King County where the investigation took place, there's a pretty good chance you didn't know about it. So no, I hadn't heard of it. And yes, it was out of the blue. What had happened was a friend of Emmanuel's in the facility where he was then incarcerated had read the Atlantic article and said, oh, this guy's talking about exactly what's involved in your case. You should reach out to him. And it was the friend that reached out on Emmanuel's behalf.
So you had this initial curiosity, you had the experience with DNA, and you reach out to Emmanuel. And tell me about that first contact that you guys made. What was that like? Not really knowing anything about it, and then having him tell you that initial spark of the story.
It was a frustrating first experience trying to get in touch with Emmanuel, because if you've ever corresponded or called or spoken by phone with someone who's incarcerated, they only have certain amounts of time, the inmates at facilities like the one Emmanuel was in, to make calls. And then when we got on the call, you can hear this in some of Emmanuel's interviews that are in the podcast. Emmanuel he was incarcerated for so long. He sat through his two trials, was not able to verbally participate in those trials. And he's participated in so many interviews, and I'm not even counting the police interrogations, that it's almost like it's become almost rote to him. And, it was frustrating in that regard, because it was like, by no fault of his own, but he didn't know what I didn't know, because he knew so much about the case. And so it was very much, it was a process of trying to find my footing, basically, and trying to understand exactly what had happened in the order that it had happened in. And the person who was integral in that regard was Ben Goldsmith, who was Emmanuel's second public defender. And Emmanuel gave Ben permission to talk to me off the record at that point, and to share documentation, including transcripts. And that was when I really did start to wrap my head around it.
Yeah, I mean, I find it interesting. In the story, it has such a long lifespan. I mean, it's still going on. And, the event happened in 2008, but it sounds like when you got involved, even years after the fact, you were still very much, the story was still unresolved. You were still very much in the middle of it.
Yeah, I mean, and then you think of what happened at the end of the second trial, right, with the acquittal, which sort of is a reset again, right, and leaves things even more unresolved. Because there are people out there who believe that Emmanuel Fair killed Arpanet, even though he has been acquitted of the crime. But when the acquittal happens, then it's sort of all up in the air again, right? It's like, who is anyone ever going to get arrested for this? But even when Emmanuel was in jail waiting for the second trial, there was a sense that, yeah, it had happened a long time ago, but everybody had just been really affected by different parts of this case, right? And affected in a way that made it very difficult for them to leave it or to not be super emotionally involved in it. And that went for Arpanet's friends and family members. It went for witnesses who had been at the party the night that Arpanet was killed. And it sounds a little reductive, but I think it really is the truth in this case, that people wanted justice in some way. They wanted resolution, and they weren't getting it. And that's often when, as a journalist, you find people most willing to speak to you, right? And again, like, this goes for the other side of the equation, right? I mean, Aaron Ellert, Brian Coates, the prosecutor and detective, respectively. I don't know this for sure, but I would wager a big reason they talked to Eric and Natalia and I is that they also feel that it's unresolved, right? In a frustrating way. So yeah, I mean, and it's not over, right? In a sense, it's a cold case now. I guess officially it might be a cold case, but people are going to be thinking about this and wonder suffering for the rest of their lives.
Who would you say was the most challenging interview you had to do?
In terms of emotional interviews, I found the interview with Jeff, the juror, to be challenging in the sense that this was a person whose conception of what it would mean to be a juror and to be a part of the criminal justice system was so radically different from mine and what I would hope anyone's would be, that it just it was like an exercise in me getting my incredulousness under control and trying to finish the interview. In terms of pure emotion, and you can hear this in the show, Jay, the family friend who found Arpana's body, I interviewed him in person and he was there with his son. And, it's often really easy with this kind of reporting to forget how these cases can affect people who aren't, a family member of the victim or a super close friend. It's like these cases are like storms or like hurricanes, right? Like they destroy everything that gets close to them. And Jay was so open about what he had been through and so hurt by it, right? And also that he brought along his son because it was so important for him to tell his son what he'd been through and to try to explain to him. It was really moving. And I have so much gratitude and appreciation for Jay for doing that interview because frankly, I don't know if I was in his position if I would have done it. So again, different types of challenging, but challenging nonetheless.
A few days before Christmas, Janelle Matthews disappeared from her home. There were no signs of a struggle, no eyewitnesses, no DNA recovered. But what if the answer had always been there? What if a true crime fanatic who'd been talking about the case was more than just an obsessive fan? The groundbreaking true crime podcast Suspect is back with a new story that attempts to separate fact from fiction and one man's true crime obsession from a motive for murder.
He says, "Don't fuck with me, Officer Edgerton. I've buried more people than you'll know."
He's providing information that hadn't even been released to the news yet.
He's such a good liar that he can convince the juror that he wasn't involved.
Follow Suspect wherever you get your podcasts. Hey, Prime members, you can binge the entire series ad-free on Amazon Music. Download the Amazon Music app today. A few days before Christmas, Janelle Matthews disappeared from her home. There were no signs of a struggle, no eyewitnesses, no DNA recovered. But what if the answer had always been there? What if a true crime fanatic who'd been talking about the case was more than just an obsessive fan? The groundbreaking true crime podcast Suspect is back with a new story that attempts to separate fact from fiction and one man's true crime obsession from a motive for murder.
He says, "Don't fuck with me, Officer Edgerton. I've buried more people than you'll know."
He's providing information that hadn't even been released to the news yet.
He's such a good liar that he can convince the juror that he wasn't involved.
Follow Suspect wherever you get your podcasts. Hey, Prime members, you can binge the entire series ad-free on Amazon Music. Download the Amazon Music app today.
This is a story that takes place in Seattle area, and it sounds like you did a lot of on the ground research. As far as places that you went, were there any experiences there that really touched you in some way when you visited them in person?
When we really started making our plans for the in-person trips, there was a part of me that was like, man, is this really going to be worth it to do this, right? To fly. It's the first time I'd flown during the pandemic. Is it worth the energy that we're going to put into this kind of travel to be there? And the short answer is that it was, right? Because on the one hand, it allowed us to experience places and see places, and on a technical level, collect tape from places that were integral to the story, right? So that includes the passageway that leads from the King County Courthouse to the jail. It includes the botanical gardens. It includes the Valley View. And, you can use Google Maps and you can get somebody on a Zoom call, but being able to see these places and to hear them you can't replace that, right? There's no replacement for it. And that became very much part of the story right there. As a reporter, you can cold call people all you want. You can use Facebook as a tool to track people down. We did both of those in this story. You can beg people for cell phone numbers. But nothing beats being able to knock on a door, right? And the Valley View is a good example. I was striking out trying to find Arpana's neighbor, who effectively really the only witness that exists to the crime, the man who almost certainly heard Arpana being killed, Kyle, who lived on the other side of the wall from her. I tried, days trying to find him. Nothing doing. And then we get to the Valley View, and it's the middle of the day. We're walking around, and there's some guy outside, and we're like, hey, did you used to live here in 2008? Guy said, I did, but I didn't go to the party. And then we said, well, have you heard of a guy named Kyle Rose? Like, he's right upstairs. I'll give him a call right now. And we got him, we had an interview with him the next morning. It was as easy as that. So there are workarounds now, and we're getting better at learning what they are in this coronavirus age, but it's very hard to completely work around being there in person.
Sure. No, I mean, it was very similar for Fox Lake. It was a challenge to report it during COVID, but once you go there, there's just certain places have a feel to them, and they definitely inform your storytelling. But also as a journalist, as a writer, you're trying to communicate what these characters and these people are going through, and so being there and seeing it in person. Did you go up to Arpana's door at the Valley View? Did you, how close did you get to that experience?
Yeah, we did, and we talked to the guy it's a man who lives there now in her unit. He'd been separated by two previous tenants from Arpana, and I never knew her. And we said, hey, can we talk to you? But he declined. He didn't really have anything to say. But we'd seen the crime scene footage and photos, and in a sense, I'd almost seen way more than I wanted to see of Arpana's apartment. The order that all of this happened is that we started looking, Eric and Natalia and I started looking into the case, compiling all the reporting, and we got some photos from the party and from the crime scene, and it was just devastating to see. And then, by the time we got to the Valley View, it was like, I don't need to see the inside of that apartment. I thought it would be much more important, and it ultimately was, to get the perspective of people who had been there that night, because that really was a little bit of the missing piece, right? It was like, what order did everything happen in? What did people remember and what couldn't they remember? And what did the police ultimately do with that information? Those were the most important things to us.
There's this really important thread that runs through Suspect about the criminal justice system and how it does discriminate against people like Emmanuel. And it sounds like it sort of came about organically. Like, you were interviewing Emmanuel, you were talking to Ben, and then you just started looking at the facts. And it really struck me how well you were able to incorporate that into the narrative, and how important it is to the story, because it's really, I guess, fundamental to understanding how the police went about trying to investigate this homicide. And I wondered if you were you discovering things as well about the criminal justice system while you reported this story? Did you learn something new yourself?
Well, most importantly, we were discovering things about Emmanuel's case, right? So when Emmanuel was younger, when he was 20, he was charged with rape, and I did not know the circumstances of that case, because it could not be admitted at the trials. The judge forbade prosecutors from introducing it. It was sort of in the press accounts, but it wasn't really. And so we spent a lot of time. I mean, we spent, a solid couple of months processing this and talking about it and thinking about how to present it to people. We had a female producer, Natalia, lead the reporting on that, and we talked to as many people as we could, including the victim. And we ultimately decided that we would convey just the facts as we understood them, exactly what had happened, while honoring the victim's own statements. And it was the biggest single challenge in making this show, and it was not something we ever took lightly. But when you pull back and you start to look at the case as a whole, right, and this is where I do feel like I learned a lot, right, and where I do start to get a sense of how things happened the way that they did. I do not think that the Redmond Police Department should not have looked into Emmanuel Fair as a potential suspect based on his criminal history. But I do think that the way that he was ultimately treated from the beginning to the end of his experience with this particular murder investigation was not how a lot of other people would be treated, and probably not how a white person would be treated. Now, I can't get inside police officers' heads. I can't get inside prosecutors' heads. But I do know that the American criminal justice system has a deep and long-held problem with systemic racism. And I do believe that Emmanuel, in his circumstances, was from a young age, came in direct contact with that criminal justice system, and that it shaped him, and that it still affects him today. And I just don't think you can pry these two things apart. I think this is sort of, if you're asking about the realizations that we made during the show, one is that it's very hard for people to say, and I include myself in this, it's very hard for people to separate parts of our history, right? Like we look at people who have a long rap sheet and we say, well, that must be who that person is. But it's not always who that person is. It's often a product of forces well beyond their control, which I think in a lot of ways is what happened to Emmanuel. The other realization, and it sounds a little more prosaic or I don't know, mundane, is that people in the criminal justice system have immense amounts of power in their decisions. And again, it's like, well, you can say that, but of course they have immense amount of power. We as a society vest that power in them. But when you see it in this way, as we tried to lay it out in this podcast, what you're really seeing is almost like Emmanuel loses a little bit of agency, right? And he's almost like passed from person to person, each of whom makes a decision that affects his future, right? It's the investigators, it's the forensic analysts, it's the prosecutors, it's the jurors, it's his own defense attorney, right? And the amount of power that all of those people hold over what happens to him and what happened to him is immense. It's hard to wrap your head around. And I think that the clearest example here is when you talk to the jurors, right? Or when we talk to the jurors who you hear from in the show, and it's like, these are people who have another human's life completely in their hands, and you want to think they understand the criminal justice system perfectly. You hope that they do, or at least their duties perfectly, because look at the power that they have now over somebody's life. And when you find out that power is maybe, struggling for the nice way to say this, maybe not taken as seriously as you would hope, or that the knowledge isn't there, or maybe even that it's willful ignorance, that it's dismaying. And that's the kind of stuff that I personally find myself thinking about now, and thought about long after the reporting for this was done.
You bring in a great element to the story, and that's science. So we have this perception, right? We have the jurors are looking at the person on trial, and they're making their own, judgments based off their appearance. Do they look like a criminal? Whatever. But then you have this thing, right, with DNA, this science, right? And it seems to, this is gonna cure all that. This is gonna be the equalizer, right? But it's not really like that. It's kind of like a double-edged sword. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, like how you feel about DNA being used in the courtroom, and is that really this equalizer that's going to bring the truth out?
Well, that's what we're accustomed to thinking, right? That it's the Law and Order SVU green light, that this is the person who committed the crime. The problem is, as we discuss and sort of quite a bit in this show, DNA does tell you who, but it doesn't tell you where or when. DNA can be transferred, DNA can sit on objects for long periods of time. So it's a fallacy, this idea that shows like Law and Order SVU promote, that just the presence of DNA on a crime scene is proof of a person's guilt. Now, there are a lot of people who are far smarter than I who have done a lot of thinking about the usage of forensic DNA in investigations like this. And what they would say, that any tool in the criminal justice system, prosecutors and police have historically found a way to use it against minorities in some way. And I'm not saying this happened. I want to make it clear. I'm not saying that this happened in this case, because I can't get into people's brains. I think it raises the specter that something like this happened in this case, and Ben Goldsmith would argue that it did, which is the sort of tail wags the dog thing, right? Where, let's say you and I are detectives, and we go into a crime scene, and we see somebody passing by, looks a little weird, and we're like, oh, that guy, let's look into him. And then, because we're so focused on him, we're starting to find evidence that fits our theory, and we're starting to discard the evidence that does not fit our theory. So yes, we do end up finding this person's DNA inside the crime scene, but we also find a bunch of other DNA inside the crime scene and on the victim. But we don't, we think about it, but we don't decide to go in that direction because part of us has already made up our mind, right? And this is a real fear, and it is something that can happen. It's why there's such a movement to separate police forensic labs from police detectives, right? So there's no interplay between them. Here's what I'd say as far as the jury goes. Emmanuel would probably be in prison right now if it was not for Ben Goldsmith. I don't mean that in a way that Ben is some, superhero, but Ben is a extremely intelligent, committed attorney who thought deeply about the DNA science and litigated the hell out of this case. And he really, really fought. He was like, the presence of this DNA does not mean that Emmanuel did it, especially if there's no plausible theory as to motive, and especially if there's other DNA that points to other people. And you know what? The jury, and this is also credit to Ben and his co-counsels, the jury understood that. When we talked to the jurors, not Jeff, because he's kind of in a different bucket. When we talked to other jurors, they were like, yeah, like, I'm not sure. They'd be like, well, I'm not sure I really understood all the technical details of the DNA, but I did know that there was a ton of DNA that was linked to other people, not just Emmanuel. So yeah, maybe Emmanuel, but certainly doesn't put us beyond a reasonable doubt, right? So they did get Ben's argument, right? It registered with them.
You had this very powerful scene near the end when you're talking about Emmanuel and how this case affected him, and how he was going off to his job, and he seemed almost afraid that he at any moment something could happen to him, and this whole case really shook him. What is he doing now? What are his next steps as far as moving forward?
So he's doing okay. As you might expect from a person who's been through what he's been through, he's got a fair amount of what he thinks, and I'm sure is true, is some form of PTSD, right, from being in jail. He's got a job. He works overnight security. He bought himself a car, which we say at the end of that last episode. He has a network of friends. He's got his aunt and uncle. But it's tough going, right? I mean, I think one of the peculiar tragedies of this is that if Emmanuel had been, I guess it's a peculiar irony, not a tragedy, is that if Emmanuel had been convicted and then his conviction was overturned, he'd be eligible for wrongful conviction relief from the county. But because he was acquitted and not actually convicted, he's not entitled to the same sort of potential compensation. Now, he does have a civil attorney, and we didn't mention this in the show because it happened more recently. He has a good attorney in Seattle, and this attorney is preparing to sue on Emmanuel's behalf on 3 lines. They're suing for the deprivation of civil rights, which is guaranteed by the 4th and 14th Amendments. They're suing for malicious prosecution, and they're suing for negligence. And this is all against King County. So we'll see. I mean, that paperwork, I believe, has been filed, or if it hasn't been filed yet, it will be in the next few weeks, and that could provide some sort of relief and closure for Emmanuel.
And Arp and his family are back in India. Have you reached out to them? Have they reached out to you? Have they listened to the podcast?
I know that Arp and his friends who we interviewed, Shri and Lalitha, know the podcast is there, as do Arp and his family, and just feel it's a little too painful to listen to. I know that, and this is true both of Arp and his sister and of her 2 closest friends, that they're confused, right? Like how this turned out. And that's the sort of overwhelming feeling. It's like, how could this go on how could this case and investigation and prosecution go on for so long and the way it did and not have anyone else charged, right? So it's like, it's a question of like, how did that happen? And then it's also, a question of rethinking what they thought they knew about the case, and making room for the possibility that maybe Emmanuel didn't do it, which is, as is often the case with the family of a victim or close friends, they're most in touch with the prosecution and police in the course of the trial, and I think that was the case here. So yeah, it's kind of like, well, maybe what I knew about this case isn't exactly right. So I think there's a kind of reckoning going on as well.
Yeah, I mean, some of the scenes, and especially the Arpana singing the song, I would imagine those would be tough moments to relive. But at the same time, I would imagine the amount of energy and effort that's been put into this story does bring to light a side of Arpana and a side of, of what happened that would not have come out.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this about Arpana's parents, and I think it's, we did everything in our power to make sure Arpana was depicted as a real person in this show, right? That she was not ever overlooked in any way. And obviously in the later episodes, it becomes much more about the trial. But we did want to wind up back with Arpana because she clearly was an amazing person, fascinating person, and people do want to remember her. So if that's one takeaway that people have, that makes me feel good, that she hasn't been flattened in some way.
Since the podcast has aired, what kind of response have you gotten?
I'll be really honest with you. It's like you could almost use this show, and I hate that this is true. You could almost use this show as a political litmus test, right? And on a person's views on what the American criminal justice system is and what it should be. So if you are a leftish leaning person and you think that the American criminal justice system has a long way to go, and you're aware of the racism that has defined it for so many decades, you would think you listen to this and think, okay, this sort of confirms what I'd feared or worried about. Of course, you don't often hear from people who want to tell you, great job. In this case, I often hear from people who are on the opposite end of the spectrum and who say, well, how dare you make this about race when this was not about race? Or how dare you make these assumptions about racism in the criminal justice system or in the police or in the ranks of prosecutors? How dare you over broaden it like this and introduce something that's not there? And I don't make it a habit to write back to many of these kinds of emails, but if someone is marginally nice and open to hearing another point of view, I usually tell them about books that have influenced my thinking, like The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and I point them to essays or stories that I've read that have influenced me, and I assure them that I still don't know exactly what happened in this case, but yes, I do believe that in America we do have a problem, and that it is a problem that needs to get solved, and I try to have those discussions when I can, but it really is, it's amazingly polarized, the response, amazingly, and it makes me both glad that we did the show because I do think it can get through to people, and also a little depressed because it's like, man, every piece of content that gets consumed in this country, it's like you arrive at it with your preconceptions on board and then you like or dislike it based on that. So it's been a little bit of a wake-up call in that regard.
Seriously, I could sit here for another 3 hours and talk to you. Matt, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a great talk. I've learned a lot. Congratulations again on the podcast. You did an amazing job. I know how much work you put into it. It really captured me right from the beginning. So thanks again.
Thanks so much, Matt. It was really great getting to have this talk, and I'm looking forward to listening to Fox Lake.
Hey, Prime members, you can listen to Suspect ad-free on Amazon Music. Download the Amazon Music app today. Or you can listen ad-free with Wondery Plus and Apple Podcasts. Before you go, tell us about yourself by completing a short survey at Wondery.com/survey.
From Campside and Wondery, this is a special episode of Suspect. Suspect was reported by Eric Benson, Natalia Winkleman, and me, Matthew Scher. Eric and I are producers. David Waters is the executive producer, and our editor is Ashley Ann Krigbaum. Aaliyah Papes and Callie Hitchcock are assistant producers, fact-checking by Matthew Giles. Original music by Doug Slaywin and Netta Hadari. Consulting producers are Laura Ricciardi and Josie Duffy Rice. Mixing by Garrett Tiedemann. Studio engineer is Seth Cohen at Seth Co Sound in Atlanta. At Campside, the executive producers are me, Vanessa Gregoriadis, Josh Dean, and Adam Hoff. For Wondery, Chris Siegel is the producer. Managing producer is Lata Pandya. Executive producers are George Lavender, Marshall Louie, and Jen Sargent.
Hey Prime members, you can listen to Suspect ad-free on Amazon Music. Download the app today.
Campsite Media.
Arpana Janaga was 24 when she died. To many of her friends and family, she's still frozen as she was in 2008. A daredevil motorcycle rider, a poet, a singer, a software engineer with a whole career, a whole life ahead of her.
Even today, when we had to make a tough decisions, we were like, oh, what would Arpana do? What would Arpana think? What would she say?
To her two closest friends, Shri and Lalitha, Arpana is still very much present.
She is still part of our lives every single day. Every single day, I don't think me or Chandana forget about her. Even Chandana dream about her every month, that she's still alive. She constantly dreams about her.
Yes. Every few months, I get a dream, like she comes back saying, oh, I was just at this place and nothing happened to me. I'm absolutely fine.
Yeah.
And this is the dream I've been having for all these few years. And I tell her that she will come back. I feel like that. That's how I wake up.
So she's there. I know it's been so many years, but she's there.
Shri and Lalitha prefer not to dwell on the grief. Instead, they remember Arpana as she was when she first moved into her apartment at the Valley View. Back then, she sounded happier than they'd ever heard her. Arpana was newly independent, and that little budget apartment complex on the outskirts of Redmond, Washington, was heaven on earth.
She said in an email that it's a little paradise and she loved it.
Yes, she would share pictures like how it would look when it was drizzling outside, and Seattle is considered to be a beautiful place, and she would exactly say that. I feel like I'm in my paradise now.
Every day I wonder what she'd be doing now.
Rachel Shout was one of the attendees at the Halloween party at the Valley View, and one of the last people to see Arpana alive. She thinks about Arpana all the time, too.
If she'd have kids, if she'd be married. And I think about if we'd all still be friends and talking and everybody be happy still. She was one of a kind. But yeah, I do feel her all the time.
Arpana had a younger sister who's grown now. Pavitra wrote me an email not long ago. This world has lost a beautiful mind and a beautiful soul. Arpana believed there is good in everybody. Sadly, sometimes even when there was no good in them. I asked Pavitra, what do you make of the way the case ended? She wrote back, we expected justice to be served given how hard the prosecution worked and all the things they accomplished in terms of what can be included in the evidence. And most of all, we were looking for some kind of closure because no matter what happens, we cannot get her back. I never got to meet Arpana, but I have gotten to learn about her from her friends and family members like Pavitra. The moment I always come back to is her appearance on that TV show way back in 2005, where she'd come to talk about her award-winning invention and ended up singing a Bollywood love ballad for the host. Arpana, seated, her hair pulled back, wearing a red plaid dress, staring out into the middle distance, completely unaware of what's to come.
एहसान तेरा होगा मुझ पर दिल चाहता है जो कहने दो मुझे तुमसे मोहब्बत हो गई है मुझे पलकों की छाँव में रहने दो एहसान तेरा होगा.
From Campside Media and Wondery, I'm Matthew Scher, and this is Suspect. This is the 9th and final episode, Haunted. Through 2020 and early 2021, the reporting team on this show interviewed close to 40 people directly connected to the investigation into Arpana's murder. Almost all of those sources, at some point in the interview process, confessed how much the case haunted them. All these years later, they found it nearly impossible to shake. The acquittal, unfortunately, made things even worse. Brian Coates, the detective, and Aaron Ellert, the prosecutor,
We're still sure Emmanuel was the killer, still sure they had the right guy. But after the acquittal came in June of 2019, plenty of other people involved in the story suddenly weren't. We trusted the cops when they said they had their guy. But now, after the trial, we're not so sure. I heard this from Arpana's friends. I heard it from her sister back in India. I heard it from Jay, the guy who discovered Arpana's body. Now, we're back to square one. Now, everyone is a suspect again. Last fall, I spent a few days looking for one of the attendees of the party, a guy who had testified at trial, but had more or less vanished afterwards. None of his old cell phone numbers worked. My emails bounced back. I finally found him via a cell phone number that was listed as being connected to his family business. He was angry I'd called, didn't want to talk on the record, didn't want me to use his name at all. But before he hung up on me, he said something interesting. Although he didn't know Emmanuel Fair, had met Emmanuel only once, in fact, he was sure Emmanuel hadn't killed Arpana. The next part's a direct quote, which I scribbled down as he was talking. All the doors to the Valley View were open that night, to all the hosts' apartments. If anyone really wants to know what happened, they'll start there, because I guarantee you, this was someone who walked in off the street. He walked in, he walked out, and Emmanuel took the blame. Click. The idea that a stranger had killed Arpana was something I'd considered a couple times before. Once, when I visited the Valley View and noticed that Arpana's apartment was directly across a footbridge from the parking lot, the first door you'd encounter if entering the complex from the rear. And once when I read a document prepared by Emmanuel's attorneys in 2016. The document is called Defense Memorandum Regarding Other Suspect Evidence. It's a comprehensive analysis of the evidence in the Janaga case that did not point to Emmanuel. And honestly, it's a pretty staggering thing. In the memorandum, Ben Goldsmith is not trying to come to a conclusion about who killed Arpana. He's just highlighting and triple underlining with a Sharpie just how many questions have been left unanswered about other suspects, including 2 other men with lengthy criminal records. One of those strangers was a man named Israel Keys, a serial killer and rapist who, the FBI has confirmed, was visiting the Seattle area on Halloween weekend of 2008. The other was an Army veteran named Mark Patrick O'Leary.
He was ultimately convicted or connected to at least 6 sexual assaults or attempted sexual assaults. 2 were in Washington State in suburbs of Seattle, and the other 4 were in suburbs of Denver. The 2 that occurred in Seattle were in August of 2008 and in October of 2008. The assaults that occurred in Denver were in a 15-month period from late 2009 to early 2011.
Ken Armstrong is a Pulitzer-winning investigative journalist. In 2015, he co-authored an article about the hunt for O'Leary. The article later became the basis for a book and then a TV show called Unbelievable. I asked Ken to describe a bit about how O'Leary worked.
In terms of time and place, the case that you're looking at, it certainly fits. You know, he was living in Mount Lake Terrace, which is north of Seattle at that time, and the 2 assaults that he's been connected to in Seattle were shortly before this, right? I mean, one was a couple of months beforehand in August. The other was, I guess, 3 weeks beforehand. In both of the cases in Seattle, he used shoelaces from the victim to bind them.
Ligatures, like the one police suspected had been used on Arpana. And while O'Leary has never been linked to a murder, Armstrong suspects he hasn't confessed to everything he did.
The assaults they committed were so violent, even though in none of those 6 instances were the women killed. They were violent. There was a sadistic element to them.
Prosecutors have been the first to look into the possibility O'Leary had killed Arpana. But Ben went a step further. In 2015, he visited O'Leary in prison.
He was reluctant to talk to us initially. He thought that we were perhaps reporters. So I assured him that I wasn't a reporter, but let him know that I was defending another client in a case, and I wanted to talk to him about his possible involvement in that.
Their conversation was terse and strained. O'Leary confirmed to Ben that he preferred to attack women in the early morning hours, when they were likely to be asleep or off their guard. Shockingly, he also admitted he had surveyed apartment complexes in Redmond in the fall of 2008. How many? Ben asked. O'Leary kind of shrugged. He had no idea. Anyway, he said he had not killed Arpana Janaga. When Brianne Hughesby at the State Police Crime Lab had run samples from the crime scene against O'Leary's DNA profile, she had come up empty. Still, it's worth adding a couple of caveats here. O'Leary was exceedingly careful when it came to leaving traces of himself at crime scenes. And Brianne only tested evidence that she considered probative, meaning she thought it would help prove who had killed Arpana. Of course, what was considered probative and what wasn't was ultimately an educated guess. And in the end, that's true of so much of this investigation, as it's true of any case where no one has come forward and confessed to the crime. What's left is guesses, educated in a best case scenario, not so educated in the worst. Stories, in other words, that everyone
what's your name?